Welcome everyone to the fifth webinar in the Redefine Expectations series. Thank you for joining us. We will spend the next hour or so diving into the topic, the role of finance in development. Just a quick introduction on myself and on our guests. I've spent the last almost 25 years now deploying capital around the world, investing in different sectors at different firms, Bridgewater Associates, where I was a partner, Sango Capital, a large private endowment, and then most recently through my own firm, Sango Capital, where we do this with an exclusive focus in Africa across about 20 countries. But more importantly, I have been privileged, and I'm quite privileged to be part of the ALA family through my role on the board, the ALA Foundation board. I'd like to introduce our guests. We have today with us Brian Waweru. Brian is class of 2009, ALA class 2009. Brian is a private equity transactor at R&B Ventures, which he recently joined. And he joined the firm from Investec Asset Management and has spent quite a bit of time in over a short period of time working with lots of industry giants, Standard Chartered Private Equity, JP Morgan, as well as the Blackstone Group. Brian graduated from Wharton and also sits on the board of trustees of the ALA Academy. And then we also have Jessica Muganza. Jessica is class of 2010. Jessica is passionate about youth employment and skills development. She spends all her daylight hours really focused on how to build strategic partnerships in this space. How she spends a lot of time thinking through, within the context of the African Development Bank where she works, how to create jobs, how to enable people to build businesses that create jobs. She also graduated from ALA, obtained a BA from Tufts, and a master's in public policy from Oxford, where she was an Oxford Paula Scholar. So just to kick off, I guess just to set the stage, I think a lot of times when we think about finance and Africa, people have different starting points for thinking about that, the notion of finance and development in Africa. But just to give you some data points, I guess, to help the conversation, the World Bank recently came out and put out some numbers. One of the numbers that's interesting is they said Africa needs close to $250 billion of financing just to support the small and medium enterprises sector in Africa. Now, $250 billion of financing is not small change, depending on who you speak to, right? If you speak to someone like Mark Zuckerberg or those types of people, then $250 billion is actually not a big deal. But from an investment standpoint, to contextualize that number, the US pension funds alone over the last little while have invested north of $160 billion into just Chinese companies. So Africa offers a very interesting setup where there's demand for capital, there's a lot of growth, there's obviously a growth trajectory that is secular in nature. And maybe a good place to kick off this conversation is to ask you, Jessica, how you sort of view this evolving landscape from your perch at AFDB. How have you seen AFDB as a multilateral organization that we most often associate with development? How have you seen that organization change in its scope, in how they think about their role?
All right. Thank you so much for inviting me into the discussion. I would like to just start by positioning the AFDB. So the role of the bank itself is, like you mentioned, make economic progress through project financing, right? So that's the main kind of bread and butter of the bank, with the goal of reducing poverty, obviously economic growth in Africa. All of that is, a given. But the how, like you're saying, is what has been evolving, right? So we know that it is estimated that the financing gap for Africa to actually achieve development stands somewhere between $200 billion and USD 1.2 trillion per year. So it's really huge. So the approach of just going about it only through multilateral and bilateral funding seems to kind of be the past. It's not completely taken out, but now we're also looking into how do we bring in the private sector to have a more active role in this development space. So not only do it through like concessional loans and working with countries directly, but really bringing in the voice of the private sector more and more, right? So in order to do that, the other thing that is also visible when you look at the work that we're doing is that apart from the financing gap itself, there's also a gap in bankable projects, which calls into how the projects itself, themselves are built. So when the bank looks at the different projects that are coming up and the investors from outside that are actually interested, there's also this conversation of high risk, right? This perceived high risk of investing in low-income African countries. So that's another hurdle, right? So there's the part where you say, oh, we can't find attractive bankable projects. And then there's the part of, oh, the risk is too high, right? And then also when you get to the table, there's this question of how are you going to negotiate the best deal possible for your country, right? So all of these are problems or challenges that the bank is involved in more and more. So beyond just doing lending or providing loans and grants to countries, some of the things that we've been involved in, for instance, on the question of capacity building or having bankable projects, one of the things that the bank has been investing in a lot in project preparation is actually creating facilities. For instance, we have one called the Africa 50 Infrastructure Fund, which is set up to not only get public sector funding, but also mobilize private sector funding, but at the same time, attracting that funding by actually putting together projects that are bankable and attractive to the private sector. So there's that, right? And then on the question of risk, the bank has the private sector risk investment facility. And this is an entity that was created to kind of provide that space where you can share risk, right? And provide some sort of partial credit guarantees, partial risk guarantees, so that it can be more attractive to investors, to private sector that wants to invest into the continent. And more recently, I think we had this new platform. So I just said partial risk guarantee. So that means it's not 100%, you can go, it's completely de-risked. But through this new platform called the Co-Guarantee Platform, which I think you can also find online, here we pool basically from us and from other organizations our capacity for partial risk guarantees so that we can now help the private sector to invest without that afterthought of saying, okay, this is too risky, I can't really go in with my money. So that's kind of our response to risk. And then in terms of the negotiation aspects, which we had mentioned, the bank created the Africa Legal Support Facility to help countries themselves negotiate complex transactions for themselves so that they don't actually get away kind of like ripped off or in a way worse off than what they would if they had the capacity to actually look through that. So those are kind of the usual ways, right? In terms of the innovative approaches, I don't know how much time I have to talk about this, but we have this new, it's not really new, it started in 2018, the Africa Investment Forum, which was created to become a marketplace where people, project sponsors actually meet project financiers, people who actually want to invest in projects. So this is almost like an open platform. Usually the last 2 years, 2018 and 2019, this was held as an actual conference. This year, it was somewhat difficult given the COVID-19 situation. But essentially what happens at this conference, it's not a conference where you sit and have panels and talk about how you're going to develop Africa. It's really a transaction conference. So people come in with projects that they want to present. And what happens is that then the investors provide some sort of interest. In 2018, let me look up the numbers. In 2018, they had 400 investors from 53 countries. That was the first year. And they had 63 deals that they were presenting to all these investors. At the end of that conference, investment interest was around $40 billion for 49 of those projects. And on top of just saying this is our investment interest, what the bank does is that it created this deal tracking mechanism where now the bank itself takes it upon itself to follow up with both sides to see how they can turn that investment interest into an actual closed financial deal. And so far from that 2018, those 2018 deals, they've been able to close about 8, which are valued at $2.18 billion. So that's kind of the new approach. And the AEF is a way to change the narrative to make Africa come out more of like a confident, more proactive space for investment. Like, we're here, come to us, we have projects that could be interesting to you. So that's how I would put that in a nutshell. Yeah.
Right. Great. So before I actually jump over to my next question, just want to remind all attendees, please feel free to post questions on the Q&A function. We'll pick those up at the top of the hour here. Brian, you spent obviously some time at Investec. So not to put you on the spot here, but I assume at Investec you needed to deal with the FDB and other such entities, raise capital from them, and so on and so forth. Where have you seen the gaps or the challenges from the commercial side in terms of trying to leverage finance for development?
Thank you, Richard. And I'm excited to be here with everyone. I think from a commercial standpoint, when you think about investing in Africa, Africa is an emerging sort of a list of emerging countries, and it's competing with many other emerging countries who also need finance for development in Southeast Asia, in Latin America. And I think what you find that we are battling with is describing to investors the attractiveness of investing in Africa. So if the macroeconomic picture is not as pretty, how do you convince people that there are actually bankable projects? And I like what Jessica is talking about, things like the investment forum, because you're almost working against a narrative that says this is a low growth, high risk, highly informal place, and it's really tough to make money, right? There's a lot of currency volatility. There's not a deep secondary market to find people to actually buy your projects post-investment. And so you're always battling with a tough narrative from an investment standpoint. And I'll give you an example. South Africa, where I live currently, hasn't grown GDP by more than 4% for the last 10 years. So it's really a low growth environment, right? Inflation sits at about 5–6%. The national public wage bill is growing at about 8%. And what that means for the country is facing a deeper and deeper debt burden, right? And so whenever you're talking to investors and saying, in an environment like South Africa, we actually can find really interesting, high growth, high return investment opportunities, it becomes really tough to actually prove your pipeline of potential transactions, to prove that you can actually find the entrepreneurs with the right skill sets to execute these deals. And like Jess was mentioning, right, at a country level, if you need legal support, imagine how much support our entrepreneurs need just to understand sources of capital, to understand how to work with different advisors, to understand legal agreements, but also on the flip side of investing, how to actually execute the strategy. So I think, just to summarize, you're working in a tough macro environment. You're working to describe attractive investment opportunities, but you really have to put sort of flesh on the bone, because the picture is not as pretty when you look at it with some of the fundamentals.
How do you and I asked this question a little bit tongue in cheek, because we in my firm, we've had to go out and raise capital from US and Asian investors, commercial capital, and there are people that we meet that are very familiar with the story and can see the opportunity beyond the noise. And but last week I had a conversation, for example, where the first chart was literally a map of Africa. Just try to give people some perspective for how big the place is, right? And we you know, you've seen this map before. You've got China, India, you know, the US, and so on in there, right? So just pivoting back to you, Jessica, from an AFDB perspective, what is AFDB doing, and how are organizations like AFDB doing things differently to try to embed that evolving story in Africa? Because a lot of times I get this sense that the story is evolving faster than the world understands, and we're playing catch up. So how do you sort of respond to that?
That's a tough one. I don't think there's any one way of actually going about it. What I've seen that has been interesting is more recently I saw a bunch of kind of like South-South cooperation, like Africa having like an investment forum with India, all of these other markets that Brian talked about, to actually, because that also is part of, you know, people who are investing in the continent. So there's that aspect of that South-South cooperation, or even, you know, investment that is possible in those areas. But I think it's a tough thing to answer, because the narrative, like you're saying, is just so one-sided. So this is why things like the Africa Investment Forum were created, to really just make a splash, almost, to be like, this is, because it's not just the African Development Bank there, you know, there's Africa Import, Exports Bank, there's all of these other organizations that are reputable, that people respect, even outside of the continent, European Investment Bank, all of these other banks. Then if you have those kind of influential, respected organization looking towards the continent, then that also brings in, you know, some sort of credibility. And if people then now come to the conference, then they can be introduced to how wide it is, and the possibilities also of investment could be, because it's not just, there's this narrative of like, oh, maybe you just want to do charity, or you won't see the return of your investment, but there's so many sectors that you might not even know, but just being outside of the continent. So I think that forum in itself, it's one action, but I think it speaks really loud towards this changing the narrative aspect that we're mentioning. Yeah.
So Brian, you spent obviously a couple of years at ALA, and you grew up in Africa, spent a couple of years at ALA, and, you know, building up this perspective of all these great things you wanted to do. And then you obviously, you went to college, came back, and you know, are now in industry. How has that journey affected how you think about being effective in this space?
Yeah, it's been interesting to sort of marry that growing up in Africa, the ALA experience, and especially my work experience in the US, because I think culturally in Africa, we have a lot of things right in terms of how we think about money, how we think about a social net amongst families, how we think about retirement. But what I noticed in the US, especially working there, is a lot of these things have actually been codified into, you know, sort of institutional systems and processes. And that might not necessarily be the case in Africa, right? So, you know, when I think about growing up and we having, like, you know, someone you can call who can take you on a motorbike or a taxi somewhere. There's nothing different between that and Uber, but now Uber is seen as this innovation that's bringing about the gig economy. You know, the gig economy has existed in Africa for years. It's just that there's no one who can consolidate it into a platform and call it a marketplace and then have a business around it, right? So what I've been doing, especially since being back on the continent, is trying to think about, are there other business models we already have in Africa that maybe just need to be formalized or corporatized to be able to create this sort of transformational companies that we see? And sitting in the alternative investment side is very exciting because you can actually find capital to invest in these businesses. And you know, in the introduction, you mentioned the US pension funds and some of the big US entrepreneurs getting investors, right? When I think about a story like Tesla, a company that spends almost $2 billion a year in R&D, and this guy is raising money from public stock exchanges in the US, right? He's able to raise a $1.8 billion convertible note, you know, for a product that doesn't even exist yet, right? And we need to think about, especially in the alternative investment space, is there an opportunity to fund big ideas in Africa of systems that already exist, and just think about, you know, either consolidation or sort of just codifying anything that we are already doing very well.
So look, I think if you look at the history of investing in Africa, and I'll just use this one example. So when you ask the question, is there a way to codify things, or frankly, to take what exists and build them into something commercial? You know, I often say to people that one of the most successful investment firms in Africa took $30 million, invested it in a country where basically there was no political stability. They didn't even have cell phones. I mean, nothing, right? No newspapers, right? And they returned $500 million to investors. So the problem is, of course, that story doesn't get told that often. So the people who knew about that investor were happy to keep the story quiet because they loved that story and they wanted to replicate the story. But I do think, and we certainly see in our business, a lot more of these sorts of things happening. So, you know, you have Uber, and Uber gets a lot of press, and now there's Kobo that's doing this with trucks in Africa, for example, that I think, you know, so I think you are seeing more of these stories happen. But there's obviously been a wrench thrown into the process, which is a good pivot for us to talk about COVID. So here we are, you know, 4 months or 5 months into COVID, depending on what the country you're in. Jessica, how do you think about sort of the impact that you've seen on that long-term multilateral plan that, you know, AFDB would have had for Africa, and then now you've got this wrench thrown into it, which is COVID? How do you see that? How are you guys responding to that? Just if you could keep that to maybe a couple minutes response, that'd be good.
Yeah, I think maybe the biggest problem that we see is this the fact that obviously the continent, every country is just in over its head with, you know, all of the needs that are, you know, coming up. The lack of social protection, which is so widespread, now kind of like, you know, it's calling onto countries to actually, you know, do something. These are things that maybe were ignored, or at least, you know, they're just in the back. There's no social protection, there's no healthcare. It's okay, we'll, you know, figure it out as we go. But this is kind of like an imperative of, you know, you're going to lose your country, you're going to, and then also the question of debt, right? Like already we're so indebted. I think in 2019, the total public debt was somewhere around like $1.86 trillion. But now the estimates are somewhere between $2 and $2.1 trillion in 2020. So that's a huge burden increased on countries, which means that money cannot be freed up to do, other things that will advance the country. So those are kind of the big challenges. How the bank is approaching it, one of the things that we've done in April, we launched actually this 10 billion crisis response facility to help countries to actually deal with COVID-19 and curb its spread. And it's not just concessional loans to countries. So there's, I think, $5.5 billion going to countries in form of concessional loans, 3.1 billion going to countries again towards social protection of vulnerable communities, which, I mean, we know widely so many people are in the informal sector. Many of them are already losing their livelihoods. So how do we actually address those hard hit communities, right? But the other group that's targeted is the private sector. So $1.4 billion of that crisis response facility is actually going to go towards the private sector. And the goal here is really to kind of help the private sector stay afloat, right? To stay resilient past this crisis, because we know that it's just, for many, many businesses, this means the end. So those are kind of that's kind of the immediate response. And there's been so much of this crisis response facility money going towards countries. Where I come from, for instance, in Rwanda, they just recently got a loan at $98 million. And this is going to help, with the national budget, being able to pay teachers and all of these other expenses that the countries have, strengthening the health systems, but also at the same time, like I was saying, supporting these hard hit sectors and also creating some sort of social protection. So that's one of kind of like our biggest responses to this. The other thing is we created this $3 billion Fight COVID-19 social bond, which is like the largest US denominated social bond on the international markets, but it's really going to, so it has a 3-year maturation, and it's going to help finance some of this health and some of the essential goods and services that, because we know this is not going to end with this year, this is going to go on for a couple of years. So that's also a question. The other thing that the president of the bank has been very vocal about is actually debt relief, debt deference for countries, because this is another huge burden on countries. If they have to pay up, how are they going to be able to free up, again, money to be able to take care of this crisis? So those have kind of been the main ways that the bank has addressed COVID-19. Okay.
Maybe just one last note before we switch to the Q&A. And this one, I guess, would be to both of you. As you think about the roles that you are playing or have played in different organizations as it relates to this topic, where have you seen substantial skills gaps? What is being done to bridge these skills gaps? If you had carte blanche to advise people that fund skills development, obviously you came out of LA, but if you had the ability to affect this on a continental level, 2 things that you would be focused on that you think would have a huge difference, make a huge difference. Let's start with you, Brian.
So I think the first
literally 30 seconds. So
okay, let me make it short then. I think we need to really think about first-time jobs, or sort of people leaving college or university, because I think that's when you sort of you've gotten the right education, and now you just need to combine it with the right experience. And I think the youth unemployment rates in different African countries, like South Africa, is at 55%. I mean, that's very scary in terms of thinking about people in their young 20s with a lot of energy and ideas, either not being able to start their businesses for different reasons, or not being able to get the work experience they need to build their careers. So I think we need to really, really think about youth youth employment and youth entrepreneurship. And I'm so happy that initiatives like Josh is leading for ALA with the Anzisha Prize are fantastic, because they're thinking about how do you focus on young entrepreneurs between this and that age, and providing them the risk capital that they would otherwise not get at banks and other institutions, just simply because they're young.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think from my end, it's not very far from that, but I think we are talking about finance, but we are kind of not talking about the huge education deficit, learning deficits that we are experiencing now as students are out of school. People are starting to talk about a lockdown generation, which, you know, like we see kids that are 12 now, but we're going to feel the effect of it even 15 years from now, you know? So many are out of jobs, so many are out of schools and apprenticeships and any other, you know, form of training or employment. So that's a huge, huge risk for us. But at the same time, this shift that we're seeing, like right now we're using this digital means to be able to talk, right? Many people might mistake this, you know, digital shift to be kind of like a temporary fix, but the way things are evolving, it seems that this is here to stay, and it's, you know, going to follow us. So what does that now mean for digital skilling across the continent? What does that mean for, you know, access, first of all, even, you know, or even in countries where, like Uganda, for instance, they're, you know, putting taxes on social media and all of this other. So this brings a whole different conversation on what this digital world means for us, and then for the youth, and then how they're going to use it to, you know, advance themselves and be able to create livelihoods for themselves.
Okay. Great. All right. So let's pivot to the Q&A. We've got got tons of questions. So we'll do rapid fire on these, and again, just appreciate you guys being sort of efficient in tackling this. Let's start with you, Brian. This is a good one. A lot of Africa, like a lot of emerging markets, is informal. You know, how do you think about, especially in your new role? I guess we won't put you too much on the spot since you just got there, but you know, how do you get places like RMB Ventures to help address opportunities in the informal sector that obviously will have a risky nature to them, perhaps not enough information flow that's available to assess them and so on? How does the formal sector that has a lot of capital really unlock growth from the informal sector?
I think the first thing is to sort of take your hat and not think about it as two separate things, right? I think the informal and formal sector, it's kind of like a Venn diagram. So if you're buying airtime on the street from a hawker or someone on the street, and you're buying a mobile scratch card, that person is in the informal sector, but you're buying airtime from a formal, sort of telecommunication company. So I think you need to think about the sort of value chain between the two sectors. At RMB, which I actually haven't started there yet, I'm starting in September. But when I think about some of the companies in their portfolio and how they've sort of thought about investing here, you can see in some of the companies that they actually focused on the informal sector, or sort of people in the low income community, which is the vast majority of sort of people in South Africa, right? Across the continent, the informal economy is 35% of the total economy. And so you just need to look at, I think, different industries and look at the value chain and think about maybe starting in the middle and not necessarily on a too informal side where you'll have to sort of do a lot of capacity building and trying to make, an $100 million business out of something that needs to go from 1 million to 10 million, right? So I think looking at the value chain, figuring out where to start in that spectrum is important.
Okay. Jessica, we have a question on inclusive and green growth. How does an institution such as the one you work for think about to help promote or help support entrepreneurs that want to be active in sort of, inclusive and green growth?
Yeah, it's a good question. So actually, the bank itself, the main guiding lines for the bank in terms of sectors, one of them is Light Up and Power Africa. So this is energy, but also, green energy. So this is a big, I'm not personally involved in that particular department, but I know that there's a huge drive. Even the 10-year strategy itself of the bank, beyond just saying economic growth, it's also how do we transition towards green growth, right? Yeah. So that's a huge thing for us, which makes it that for actually every project that goes out, that's one of the, if we are checking like gender marker, the energy and green growth part of it is a huge, part of the evaluation part. In terms of entrepreneurs who want to do this, so they have their own, in this department, they have their own approach to this, but I work in a department that focuses on youth employment. So one of the pillars of this is innovation and entrepreneurship. So one of the funds that we actually have called the Young Entrepreneurship and Innovation, Youth Entrepreneurship and Innovation Trust Fund, is actually geared towards also how do we help entrepreneurs to create green growth among just creating economic growth. So I would definitely say check it out on our website, but also if you want, you can talk to me more. I can direct you to the right people, to the person who asked this question. Yeah.
Okay. Brian, and then actually Jessica as well. Just quickly, we have a few questions on impact, and I think you both obviously approach impact from different perspectives. Maybe the first pointed question on this is this impact thing actually working? Organizations that are raising money that is classified impact capital, that is coming to Africa and doing certain things, and we won't name any names, but do you feel like that is actually having a positive impact beyond the volume of its sound or the cachet-ness of the name of the phrase, right? Are people's lives being changed? Are they being changed at scale? What would you change, if anything, around efforts that are funded by impact? Let's start with you, Brian, and then we go to Jessica.
Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. There's some firms who have it right, and some it's more of a marketing tool just to raise capital as well. I think, the guys who've gotten it right, what excites me is they're focusing on business models that either they've seen successful in other markets like India or Southeast Asia, and they're focused on innovating for, people in populations maybe that are unbanked or do not have health insurance. So it's a lot of, all these industries that have micro in the beginning, micro insurance, microfinance, anything micro and for small and medium enterprises as well. So it's exciting to see that there is some investment in those companies. I would say companies like Leapfrog have been exciting to see, some of the investments they've tried to do. I see someone in the question talked about TPG growth and Omedia. I can't really comment on those two, but on the commercial side where I sit in private equity, I think the good thing we've seen is people are asking us to report about impact, right? So for the first time, organizations like the AFDB or other, DFIs or even commercial sources of capital are asking, questions about diversity in senior management, diversity in the boardroom, how many women employees do you have? Have you looked at the, various ESG standards? Where are the risks? What's your ESG plan? So it's become a conversation now, even in the boardroom. And I think the successful companies have managed to even have, sort of ESG's committees in the board, where you talk about risk management, and COVID is a really good example to show that you actually need, risk management in these companies. Other countries like Mozambique had 2 cyclones last year that basically shut a lot of things down at the port of Beira, where we had investments at Investec, and without pre-planning for certain natural hazards and things like COVID, that needs like serious strategic planning at the CEO, CFO level at companies and at the board level. So I think impact is growing on both sides, either from impact investment companies or in the commercial side with more of an impact focus as well.
Okay.
I would say that for me, when I think of impact, primarily really is, are we improving the quality of life of Africans, right? That's kind of the bottom line, right? And I think through the project that we do, you can see some of this impact crystallize, for instance, with road projects or an energy project where you're electrifying a whole section of a country. Those things kind of come like forth, and you're like, yes, this is the number of people who are actually benefiting from this. But recently, one that I saw that was actually really interesting, we invested in this water supply and sanitation project in Somalia. And now with the COVID-19 surge, you can see how much this is something that was done before we actually had COVID, be part of our daily lives. But investments like that, which are not often seen as like the sexy ones, the ones that are, kind of like talked about the most, at the core of it, if you're helping internally displaced people and refugees in a country like Somalia that maybe some people have given up on, actually have access to water and sanitation during a crisis like this, I count that as impact. The point now is how much of it, because it's like a drop in the bucket in terms of what's needed. So that's really where it kind of like, either like some people get discouraged, but others get kind of revigorated because, we have a long way to go. But I think the impact is there. It's kind of incremental, but like we need to like accelerate it and, find other innovative ways of, it's kind of like a buzzword, but really like we need to find new ways of doing things so that we can get there faster.
Mm. Yeah. So just maybe switch a bit here to there's a few questions coming in on startups, early stage investing, early entrepreneurship, and so on. So let's spend a little bit of time there. First of all, on sort of there's a question here on sort of the rise of venture capital in Africa, or more formalized funding, venture funding. Brian, your new firm is called R&B Ventures. So not that they do early stage funding, but prepare yourself, right? You're gonna have to speak to this a little bit. But maybe let's just start with you, Jessica, real quick. Obviously, FDB has been very active in the early stage funding space, funding new projects. How do you scale that? Just a quick 30-second. What does FDB need to do to scale that? What does it need from the private sector? What does it need to do as an institution to scale that?
Yeah, I think you're right. On a macro level, there's been all of this. I think what's interesting that's coming up recently is more on the micro level, right? So the SMEs, which we know employ the most people across the continent. How do we actually do this right on their level, right? So one of the instruments that we actually have is this facility called Boost Africa, which is partly in collaboration with the European Investment Bank. And here, this facility aims to actually leverage technology to spur, growth within SMEs who are kind of like tech-driven or tech-enabled. So this is kind of like another type of investment that the bank normally, or in its traditional mainstream way of doing things, wouldn't kind of go towards. But I think this is a step in the right direction to actually look at micro enterprises and SMEs as, especially because many young people are involved in this, and we know that the most hard hit with unemployment. So I think those kind of this kind of initiatives help in this direction. Yeah.
Okay, Brian.
Yeah, I think we need to think about the stages, and I think I talked about this one, the stages of financing of a company, right? So when you're starting out, even before you talk about venture capital, right? What are the sources of financing before your seed round? You know, is it friends and family? Are there sort of innovation hubs that you can go to? And we've seen a proliferation of innovation hubs in Africa, right? In places like Nairobi and Johannesburg. I think there's one called Founders Factory in South Africa that has links with Standard Bank and has links with Netcare, which is a big hospital chain in South Africa, and they're focused on financial services and healthcare, right? And thinking about how can businesses get the right business model, and once you have that, you know, here are these distribution channels for you, either with Standard Bank customers or with hospitals across Netcare. So it's very exciting to see the creation of innovation hubs that allow entrepreneurs to have access to customers, expertise, because when you're starting a business, you typically need the same things to be put in place, right? You need some legal support, some product development, some, you know, marketing work and customer sort of surveys. So these innovation hubs, I think, are crystallizing that, and hopefully we have more and more African-owned, African-funded ones. At the venture capital stage, I think that has grown. Even private equity companies are looking at companies that, the same companies that venture capital firms are looking at. So it's very exciting to see some businesses like you mentioned, Kobo 360 in Nigeria, which is a very young business that's starting an Uber for trucks. And then we had Goldman Sachs investing $40 million in them, right? So it's very exciting to see a business that's not even 3 years old attract investments from, you know, Goldman Sachs PIA account. In SA, I think going back to the idea of marketplaces I was talking about, there's a business called Sweep South that is for cleaning ladies on an app, so you can like order someone to come clean your house, and they've gotten a lot of funding from venture capital firms like CRE Venture Capital, which is also African owned. So it's a very, very exciting space, and it's really good to see that, especially on the private equity side, because we tend to look for mature businesses that have, you know, a couple years of financials, they have a really proven business model. And the more success we have at the venture capital stage, the bigger the pipeline of transactions you'll be able to see going to players in the private equity space, or even just going to the local stock exchanges that we have, right? The last example I'll give, which is not necessarily VC, but, you know, sort of a local company in Kenya called Keroche Breweries, which is a locally owned brewery company. And a lot of people who've been to Kenya think, you know, Tusker is Kenya's beer brand, but Tusker is actually owned by East African Breweries, which is owned by Diageo, right? So at the end of it, you have a majority foreign owner, whereas when you see businesses like Keroche being able to sprout up, getting all this support, being able to access funding in different innovative ways, and actually, you know, making a local success, I think that should make people in venture capital be more and more attracted to Africa.
I mean, the points you make, Brian, actually, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add that hearing Brian talk, this is actually also like a really exciting space for us, especially as we look at young people. This idea of, do we have businesses that are actually capital ready? Because we know that most businesses die in that early stage, you know, most ideas die in that early stage, you know, startup phase, but few of them come up to this, you know, capital level. So one of the things, the fund that I mentioned earlier, the Youth Entrepreneurship and Innovation Trust Fund, one of the things that it does is really to look at these innovation hubs, accelerators and incubators that are kind of, you know, sprouting across the continent, and say, how do we actually give capacity to these accelerators and incubators to actually be able to train or to groom these ideas and these young people who have these ideas to the level where you know, they can be capital ready, then they can take advantage of opportunities that the Boost Africa was talking about, or any other venture capital opportunities. So that is like a really big part of what we're trying to drive, especially on the youth employment front. Yeah.
So that's a good jumping off point, actually. There's a couple more questions here that relate to the gaps there, and I'll just make a couple of quick comments. I think someone asked the question, is the venture industry, do we have a maturing venture capital industry in Africa? The answer is no. I can tell you categorically, because we invest in venture as well, and the answer is no. But it is also evolving at light speed. I mean, the number of professional venture firms that we've seen that have teams that are investing capital in a way that's not different than is done in other markets around the world is multiples of what it was 5 years ago, even when we looked at this space. The number of businesses that they have to look at, the number of business competitions that people can go to pitch their ideas. And so that landscape, I think, is changing quickly. I think one of the gaps there, frankly, is someone asked the question about, you know, why is it difficult to raise more funding from within Africa for startups? I think oftentimes people feel that the natural challenge is availability of capital. Actually, that is not the problem. So, and I'll give you the one anecdote I'll give is, you know, in our business, it's not unusual for us to hear from people in different countries who say, hey, we've got cash and we like, what are you guys doing so we can come alongside you and do stuff, right? And the only reason they do that is not because there's no opportunities in their countries, because no one has packaged them in a way that they can understand, because a lot of the folks who would have enough capital that's liquid, that can be investable in this space, come from a generation that understands opportunities differently than the opportunities that exist today, right? I mean, they're used to buying land and you know, buying buildings and so on. And so when you've got a new fancy beer, right, they need to make sure that this is actually going to work, right? And so I want to use this to pivot into a question that's been asked about the education sector, and maybe have you, Jessica, talk about this. Obviously, you have a passion around this space. Talk about the gaps you see, particularly in bridging education to this set of opportunities that we've been talking about.
Yeah. I think one that's obvious and that is talked about all over is just the mismatch between what we are taught and what we actually find on the job market. So if you're able to even have a job, you've realized, like, well, all of those things I was learning, where am I applying them? So that is a huge, huge problem across the continent, which calls for, I think, a sort of rapprochement between the governments who set up all of these you know, curriculums with the private sector and other employers who actually need this type of skills to know, are these things actually matching? You know, or are you teaching the right things? And then even with this advent of COVID, I think it even brings the question even more weight, because at the moment, if this is going to be our normal, where we work from home and like, you know, we have to have self-direction, self-leadership, you know, to be able to do your things, it's no longer going to be kind of this time input approach, right? Which means that this, again, this education system where it's just input without really looking at the outcome is completely not only just like out of its time, it's dangerous in a way, because you're literally selling aspirations that people are never going to reach because you're not giving them the tools to actually get there. So how do you think about this new type of worker? What kind of skills do we need to impart on them in order for them to actually, you know, become entrepreneurs that we're talking about, or work in other sectors? The other thing that I see that's kind of lacking is also around the space of technical vocational education training, right? So countries that we know that have industrialized, that have, you know, gone for it, this has been one of the main drivers, engine of industrialization. But in our countries, we still have this perception that technical vocational and education training is just for people who didn't make it in school or for people who didn't, And again, this type of reality that we're seeing right now, which is placing a lot more emphasis on apprenticeships and being able to learn on the job, is recalling that, so are we going to sit and take 10 hours of chemistry, or are we going to find a way to apply it? So really those are the main challenges, the main issues that we need to be addressing as nations, but also as a continent, because you also need that transferability of skills, right? If the continental trade agreement is going to work, and then now we're going to have movement of goods, we're going to have movement of people, hopefully, across the continent, you need that to be transferable to other countries, to other markets. Now we have remote working, so you don't even have to leave your country in order to, find jobs outside. But how are you going to be the most competitive person? Because now you're not only competing against people in your village or in your country, it's the whole world you're competing against. So that's what I would say.
Okay. We are fast running out of time here. So 30 seconds to each of you for closing statement. Brian, go. I'm counting.
That's a tough one. Closing statement. I think we have a big audience, so we have 94 people. I think for those who sort of are in positions where, you're making decisions about employment, you're running your own companies, I think thinking about mentoring young people is very important. I would say ALA, I'm a beneficiary of ALA doing a very good job linking, me with people who can support me in my career. And don't underestimate the impact you can have on a young, ambitious person very early on in their career. So I think mentoring is very, very important. And I think even for us who've just been a couple years out of ALA, it's worthwhile to look back and look at students who are currently there and just think about that mentoring thing as a continual sort of revolving door, because that's the only way we are all gonna sort of excel in our own fields. It's the only way we're gonna hold each other accountable for the opportunities we've been afforded. And for finance, and sort of looking at finance in Africa, I would say, don't be discouraged by the macro. There's a lot of industries and companies that are really interesting, that are growing very fast. And there's lots of opportunities to invest capital and to make money in Africa. And the fundamental thing is, it is a big continent with a huge population, and a lot of change is happening, right? I think the digitization of a lot of systems, the inclusion of many people into the formal economy in different ways is going to just create lots of exciting opportunities. And also this COVID experience we've had is going to make us think about risk differently.
Good. Yes.
Yeah, I really like the mentorship aspect that Brian mentioned, so +1 on that. But also, this is to the young people. I think what we are learning in this moment, and that we've been seeing, is that things are changing, and it's scary, right? It's kind of uncomfortable, but it's also a moment to change things, to question why things are the way they are, and if we can do them differently. So I would just challenge young people to actually kind of like, I'm not going to say like make their voices heard, because that's so generic, but in the sense like recognize the multitude that we are on this continent, right? And just towards this, like we need to be changing this narrative about other people making decisions on our behalf. Like we are going to be this almost like 1 billion, in force, right? But I think we're not going to wait until we're like 50 to start saying like, oh, now I can participate. So I think that idea, even in our own education, even in the way we want to make social change, or even just businesses in our communities, I think we need to push harder, because it seems that for us to be hard, we need to kind of make a ruckus to get there. So I would say this is an interesting and exciting time to think about things differently, and just try.
Great. Listen, thank you very much to both of you. I'll hand this back to you, Leo.
Thank you, Richard. Hi, everyone. I am Kalalelo from South Africa. And for those who are new to the series, I am part of the team that coordinates our Redefine Expectations webinar series. I'd like to thank you all tonight, Richard, Jessica, Brian, for your insights and your unique perspectives shared today. Many people don't know this, but before joining ALA, I myself worked in the finance sector, in the public sector at the National Treasury of South Africa, and then pivoted into the private sector investment side with Alan Gray. So I can appreciate the sort of balanced responses that we've heard from our panelists tonight to the questions posed, Richard. The world of finance and investments is complex, right? So it's not surprising that solutions for Africa in the sector, and particularly during these times, would be complex as well. But seeing that coincidentally, our hosts and panelists are all from the east of this continent of ours, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, by way of you, Jessica, I'm confident that at the very least, our eastern region of the continent is in good hands and very well represented by you all. So thank you for your time again today. Today marks our 5th episode in the series, having covered topics on healthcare, education, governance, creative arts, and now tonight, finance. And realizing Africa's development often requires innovation, technology, and engineering. So with that being said, I'd like to invite you all as our attendees to the next Redefine Expectations webinar that will be happening in a couple of weeks' time. We will be speaking to more of our alumni who are doing amazing things in the engineering and innovation sector. So please look out in the next while for our social media pages for the date on that. But otherwise, thank you for joining us today. Stay safe and goodbye.
Thank you.